2 o'clock, and so we'll make a start on the afternoon session. So we're here now to discuss issue 4, are the site allocations, SP 5.1, 5.2 and 5.3 in policy SP 5, sound and deliverable. Just a couple of general issues to discuss first before we move on to each site in turn. So that, as I said before the break, the first thing I want to raise is employment land provision, which I know we have already discussed to some extent in a previous session, but we have Harlow District Council here and Essex County Council, and I think from my reading of statements they're still suggesting that the scale of growth in the garden communities, particularly at Latham Priory, requires further assessment to understand whether more employment land is needed. So if I could ask for your views on that, and also whether it's justified to allocate 1 hectare of employment land at Dorrington Farm within the Latham Priory allocation. I think the question that's been raised there is its location in relation to the strategic road network, whether that's the right location for the allocation or whether it should be elsewhere. So if I could come to the council first, please, and then we'll hear perhaps from Essex County Council and Harlow before moving on.
Thank you, Madam. As you said, it has been discussed a number of times already, so I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just try and give an overview of the position. The Council's position with respect to the matter you've raised is set out in its Matter 8 hearing statement, and particularly paragraphs 47 to 55. Also its hearing statement on Matter 5, Issue 3, Question 1. In addition, the Functional Economic Market Area authorities signed a Memorandum of Understanding in May 2018 with respect to the distribution of objectively assessed employment need across the West Essex and East Hertfordshire Functional Economic Market Area. That's EB 1202. The requirements are set out and include at paragraph 2.3.8 the requirement to develop an improved shared understanding around the economic growth of the FEMA, Functional Economic Market Area, and specific future requirements of the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, including the commissioning, interpretation, and effective application of any future joint evidence work where required. Essex County Council, whilst not a signatory, supported the Memorandum of Understanding. The Council, Epping Forest District Council, is satisfied that based upon the available evidence, when taken as a whole, the new Garden Town communities, together with Harlow, will provide for more than sufficient employment land to support the needs of new residents. The employment allocation at Dorrington Farm, within the Latham Priory Strategic Master Plan area, provides the opportunity to provide highly accessible new employment uses through a comprehensive master planned approach, linked to the sustainable transport corridors. When taking the proposed 1 hectare of new employment land, together with the 0.91 hectares of existing employment land, this site alone has the potential to generate some 1,130 new jobs. In addition, it is also important to recognise that job opportunities are not just created through the allocation of land for the B use classes. The provision of local centres, primary and secondary schools, as well as local services within the Garden Town communities will create jobs in the local centres, as well as through the schools themselves. In terms of your next question on justification for the allocation at Dorrington Farm, the justification for the allocation is provided within Appendix F1.5.3 of the site selection work, which is entitled Results of Identifying Sites for Allocation. That is EB 805AH. The existing Dorrington Farm employment site is proposed to be allocated for employment uses, with a further 1 hectare of additional employment land for B1A/B1B uses. The existing employment site at Dorrington Farm is capable of being redeveloped at a greater density than currently as part of a comprehensive scheme, with the proposed 1 hectare of new employment land. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we hear from the County Council?
Thank you. Just to explain the County Council's position, and I don't want to repeat everything that's said in our statements or our representations, although I do appreciate as well that some people, or perhaps many people, may not have read those or be aware of them. In a nutshell, the County Council's concerns have arisen from the fact that the allocations within Epping Forest District on the edge of Harlow District amount to nearly 4,000 homes. We've been very clear as a Garden Town partnership, and it's clear that from the local plan as well, that the Garden Town is going to be based on clearly TCPA garden community principles. The usual approach towards employment provision and easy access to employment provision locally through sustainable modes of travel is seen as an extremely important garden community principle. But the usual approach to this issue is that normally garden communities approach this on the basis of providing for one job per household, sometimes slightly more than that. But as a general proxy, we think that's a pretty good starting point, basically. So what we have is 4,000 homes allocated on the edge of Harlow without commensurate local employment opportunities being provided by Epping Forest District Council. It's been mentioned that the FEMA economic evidence work that's been carried out so far was done on a FEMA-wide basis, and it worked out a collective number of jobs for the whole area and the number of jobs required accordingly for each district. It was then for each district to allocate its own number of required jobs itself, but no work was done on a spatial basis to look at that across the Garden Town. So that's where the concern really came from, and the County Council has been speaking with Epping Forest District Council and Harlow Council on this matter accordingly. We haven't been able to reach agreement yet to this effect. So we know that we are suggesting that there is no definitive answer or position on this, but clearly there is a question there that does need to be answered. County Council also points to the fact that this work is being done at the moment across a Garden Town-wide basis to look at the picture for the Garden Town and will there be enough jobs across the whole Garden Town to meet the aspirational growth that's being provided there. So we do have every confidence that we'll get the answers we need from that work in due course, but at this point in time we just don't have those answers, which are quite important. There's also no economic development strategy in place for the Garden Town at this point in time, which has been a position that the County Council has advocated for some time. Again, that is being worked towards, but that has to rely upon the evidence-based piece that I've just mentioned in the first place. So that's how we've come to the position that we're presently at, and discussions have taken place, as I've mentioned, between the various authorities, but we haven't been able to find an agreement to date. We do recognise that some employment is being provided through the Latin Priory development. Our position doesn't focus on the Latin Priory development in particular. It looks at all the Garden Town growth as a whole, of course, in line with what I said earlier, and that's where we've got to. Thank you.
Mr. Cook, just a couple of points of clarification to help me. You said that the approach in garden towns is usually based on one job per household. Where is that set out?
As I understand that, that's in the Town and Country Planning Association material around garden towns and garden communities.
Thank you. And do you know what the position is? Is this what you're saying the new work is to establish? You don't know what the position is in terms of provision across this garden town as a whole in terms of jobs per household? Is that what the work is trying to work out? Okay, so once that, what's the time scale for that work?
Yeah, the work a brief has been prepared for that, and consultants are being commissioned at the moment. So inevitably there's a bit of a lead time, and it's probably quite a substantial piece of work really when it comes to it. So I don't think we'd have answers on that very quickly, but I certainly defer to my Garden Town colleagues who may have a more up-to-date position around the intended timescales for that commission to be completed.
And so what do you think are the implications for the plan as it stands now? What's your position on the plan as it stands today in light of that additional work that you feel needs to be done?
What the County Council has said in its representations and also in our discussions with Epping Forest is that we don't feel that we are in a position to be prescriptive about the precise solutions. There are a range of different options that could be potentially looked at in respect of this. One of those is considering further employment land allocations around the Garden Town within Epping Forest, which would clearly help address any potential mismatch. There are also potential transport solutions as well that could be looked at, because I'll pass to my transport colleague fairly soon on this, but one of our main concerns is that if not enough jobs are provided within the Garden Town, we've heard about the 60-40 sustainable transport mode split, which is extremely important in terms of preserving the effects of the current transport network and keeping that actually moving. But if we don't achieve the 60-40 split, if we don't achieve a significant step change in sustainable travel, then we do risk causing unsustainable travel to work patterns for New Garden Town residents travelling further afield to work, and in particular out commuting. So that's really where that's come from. So in terms of solutions to this, we've always been very happy to work with Epping Forest on a range of potential solutions. We haven't been able to identify those solutions to date, or we haven't been able to reach an agreement from Epping Forest on how to tackle that.
Is that because Epping Forest's position is that the situation as proposed is sufficient?
If I could, Madam, I think it's important to understand the wider context. As Mr Cook's alluded to, the evidence that we have at the moment before us is the West Essex East Hertfordshire FEMA employment study. That sets out requirements for the districts, not for the Garden Town as an entity. So in terms of the requirements for the individual districts, they are being catered for through individual local plans. And there is, as we addressed earlier at a previous session, there is some flexibility and margin above the requirements in Epping Forest District to meet the needs of the district. In terms of the needs of the Garden Town, I think we absolutely agree that the Garden Town as a whole needs to be taken as one entity, and regardless of administrative boundaries, and we support the further work that is to be undertaken. However, if you take the existing evidence that we have, which is the assessment of employment needs across the FEMA, that identifies a figure of 13,400 jobs within Harlow to be provided for. With respect to B-use classes, through the allocation of 2 to 4 hectares of land for B1 and 16 hectares of land for industrial purposes. The Harlow Local Development Plan actually makes provision for 20 hectares of B1 and 1 hectare of industrial. The plan doesn't have as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a jobs target. The East Hertfordshire Local Plan, which was adopted in October of last year, makes provision for 5 hectares of employment land for B1 purposes to serve Gilston over the course of its development. This level of employment floor space is likely to provide less jobs to support the new homes being proposed in total at Gilston, if using the 1-to-1 jobs to homes ratio being suggested by Essex County Council. As I mentioned previously, Dorrington Farm, when taken with the existing and new proposed employment space, has the potential to generate over 1,000 jobs. It is estimated that the allocations proposed, together with jobs needs forecast, would therefore support the creation of some 14,968 jobs, excluding the A, C, D and sui generis uses, so in other words B uses, and excluding home working, peripatetic jobs or those created through the actual building of development, which whilst temporary would provide a constant supply of job opportunities for the whole of the planned period across the whole of the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town. The government's national housing strategy suggests that 2 jobs per dwelling are generated in this regard. Therefore, when taken as a whole, looking at the provision across the Garden Town, there is a more than sufficient employment land provision to support the jobs needs of the Garden Town. And whilst the Council is not aware of any reference in either its or any emerging Garden Town documentation to the one-to-one job requirement referred to by Essex County Council, the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town in its entirety would actually meet the provision stated.
Where were you reading from there? Was that your matter 5?
No, they were some notes I had prepared in terms of calculations, which we can supply to you if that's helpful.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Did Harlow want to comment? It would be helpful if you would, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Just iterating the points made by Mr. Cook, in that the representations we originally made, more specifically in respect of Dorrington Farm, it's clear that further discussions and work is being undertaken to address the distribution across the Garden Town area in a more nuanced way, because the FEMA didn't do that. So we, that's work in progress, and obviously the outcomes of that, we will consider, as colleagues will. However, the specific issue we had in respect of Dorrington Farm was obviously the contribution that can make and its deliverability. And obviously we've been trying to understand exactly how that would work over, in terms of the wider Garden Town and the contribution it could make. I understand, however, that the promoters of Latin Priory are possibly developing a different approach, bearing in mind what's been said in their representations. So for us, that potentially raises an issue of long-term deliverability of that. It's not necessarily an issue for Harlow per se, but obviously how that employment need, which has been planned for within Epping, could be accommodated elsewhere. And I think that's something which, again, the employment study may be able to help resolve if that was to come to fruition.
Mr. Newton.
Thank you. Just a few very brief points, because we largely endorse what Mr. Coleman has said in introducing this matter. Essentially, we consider the scale of employment land currently proposed at Latin Priory is sufficient for the allocation to function effectively. Of course, we're talking about an existing employment area of approximately 1 hectare, to which the council are proposing to add a hectare of employment land. But also to be taken into account is the significant employment potential from the local centre, from the primary school and secondary school, as Mr. Coleman has mentioned. Now, we originally raised some questions about the rationale for the allocation of the additional 1 hectare at the Dorrington Farm, but we are working to accommodate that within the strategic master plan. And the council is proposing flexibility now as to the location of that 2 hectares of employment land through the master plan process. In other words, we can determine the most appropriate location for that employment area through the master plan process. I would mention that we have historically proposed a strategic employment site of some 12 to 15 hectares adjoining London Road, should that be required to address strategic employment requirements. But I'd emphasise that that's not included within the proposed allocation, and we support the definition and detail of the allocation as currently proposed in policy SP5. So essentially, we're not pursuing a strategic employment area at Latin Priory through this examination. I think another consideration here, of course, is the extent of existing employment areas within Harlow in terms of how the Garden Town communities function, in terms of the balance between housing and employment. Thank you.
Mr. Stamp.
Just in terms of what Mr. Cook was saying about jobs and workers, I mean, I think that's a fairly generally recognised figure, about 1.1, 1.1, 1.2 jobs per dwelling as a jobs workers balance. And I know other authorities in Essex have calculated that in the past. I would hope that Epping Forest might have calculated that as well for their planning and allocations. I mean, it's something we probably come on to some of the detailed matters later on, places at matter 15. But in terms of jobs workers balance in areas to try and encourage active travel and discourage car use, that balance is a very good thing to aim for. If you've got a decent public transport system which emerges in 10, 20 years' time round the Greater Harlow area, then that allows evening out of where people work and live. But certainly in new allocations, it's heartening to hear that the Dorrington Farm allocation could produce 1,000 jobs. A bit more than that would help in terms of theoretically finding Latin Priory does have that jobs workers balance.
Thank you. Mr Taylor.
Yeah, just the 2 points I wanted to make. The initial consultation, in fact the only consultation with Harlow Council residents, had a leaflet which included a number of questions that had already been raised. And in response to one of those questions, it was said that 2,150 jobs would be created on this site. And that's why so many houses needed to be built. I think with the changing jobs market that is occurring already, with over 1,000 flats being created in Harlow from office conversions, and that's increasing by the week, I think the idea of actually loads of jobs being created on this site is rather fanciful. That's the word I would use.
Mr Cook.
Thank you. Just to return to the point about the basis for the one job per household approach, I gather that's actually comes from the DCLG guidance in 2016, and that guidance has been echoed within the Essex Design Guide as well. So I think it's a fairly well accepted approach, as has also been mentioned. So it's been used a lot elsewhere as well. I don't want to make too much of an issue of the suggested form of employment provision by virtue of Dorrington Farm or the local centres, but I think it's probably fair to say that there are some questions unanswered around those in terms of the relatively recent projections around what Dorrington Farm and the additional employment land there could deliver. And also it's probably fairly early days as yet, until we get into more detailed master planning processes, to know what those local centres are actually going to consist of, include, and therefore offer by way of future employment opportunities. So, you know, certainly there will be some jobs from the schools, from the early years provision, things like that. But I think, you know, at the moment we're still at fairly early days around all those questions to give us the kind of reassurance that we'd like to seek.
Thank you. The Council, before we move on.
Thank you very much. Just two or three brief points, really. We are, as I said, confident that the needs are being met. We don't have any evidence of further needs for employment space within the Garden Town communities in Epping. I think if we were putting forward more employment land, we would be challenged as to why we were doing so. We need to ensure that the focus across the Garden Town is on the regeneration of Harlow and the town centre. We want to support that, and we want to make sure we have sustainable communities. And that's partly where the sustainable transport corridors come in, ensuring that there are proper linkages and a network across the Garden Town. We've also not had, through the joint working we've had across the Garden Town authorities, we have never received a request from Harlow to accommodate more employment land, B-use employment land within the Garden Town communities. So, in short, I think we're very satisfied that the needs are being met, but we also want to continue working with the partner authorities to define the roles and function of the land at Dorrington Farm, and also to work up in more detail the roles of the local centres, particularly in terms of employment opportunities that they will provide.
Thank you. So we'll move on now to the sort of site-specific questions on my agenda. There are three perhaps the bottom one I'm going to put up to the top because it concerns requirements for highways and transport improvements. Now, they are site-specific, but they're general to all. So if we discuss the last one first, if I can ask the council to comment on that one. Also, then the top 2 bullet points, the modifications concerning primary school entry and the maps. I think those perhaps will be relatively non-controversial again before we move on to the green belt. So if I ask for Mr. Coleman's comments on those 3 bullet points, so the 4th one, the 1st one and the 2nd one, and then we can take comments around the table on those.
Sorry, Madam, just to clarify, so we're starting with highway and transport improvements?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So the concern and the need for the modification is in response to representations made by Essex County Council with respect to the level of detail for the East of Harlow site. No concerns, as far as I'm aware, were raised in the similar regard for the other garden town communities within the local plan. Therefore, the Council does not propose any further modifications to the policy. In terms of modifications proposed to SP5 in relation to primary schools and land requirements, in accordance with the Council's hearing statement, it is proposed that the wording is amended to refer to a minimum land area in place of a number of form of entry requirement in order to allow more flexibility in terms of school delivery. This has been agreed by way of the draft statement of common ground with Essex County Council, which is ED10.
Just before you move on, I was just wondering why, is it deliberate that the requirements, the land requirement for the Water Lane area is larger than...
Yes,
It is, okay.
it is. It's due to the calculated needs.
Thank you.
And in terms of the map legends, as I think we've discussed previously, in accordance with the Council's hearing statement, it is proposed that the map legend is amended to clarify that the residential site allocations are also expected to include land for schools and other services and infrastructure. So the proposal is to change residential site allocation to strategic site allocation.
And just on a technical note there, just if you just remind me, I think it was your intention that those maps do not form part of the policies map, is that right? The maps within the plan don't form part of the policies map.
That's correct.
That's correct. So they could be amended as a main modification with any then consequential amendments to the policies map.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Any comments around the table specifically on those 3 issues? And perhaps again, I could just ask for a comment, maybe Mr. Sprunt, if you could just comment on the last of those, which we discussed first, sorry, the highway and transport improvements. The council is suggesting modification to make the transport requirements less specific in relation to East of Harlow, but not in relation to the other areas. Would that seem to be the right approach as far as you're concerned?
Yes, there was an inclusion in the original local plan to have a road coming off the new link road to junction 7A, and there's no capacity for that to be accommodated, so we asked for that to be removed, and that's been agreed. So we're happy with that. And there's no other modifications specific to the others because they're much more general in terms of their outline in the plan.
Mr. Stamp.
In terms of F12 for Latham Priory, it seems in some ways that might be a bit too specific. It's mentioning north-south sustainable transport corridor. Southern Way, one can understand one might need that. And particularly if one wasn't going to have the link road through from London Road to that Latham Priory allocation, it could have made use of the sustainable transport corridor for vehicular access as well to Southern Way. And with a capacity on Southern Way, it's quite wide verges, lack of bus stops currently. That would be an alternative route. See that why that's mentioned. Can't see the Second Avenue corridor, particularly for Latin Priory. And obviously it doesn't mention, it mentions M11, Junction 7, but then doesn't mention those other sustainable transport, aspirational as they appear, links to tube network via Epping or other sustainable transport things. So in some ways it's a bit too specific perhaps. In some ways it's not saying enough of what really we were discussing this morning ought to be in planning for that allocation. And also to say that alternative means of access, which I know is new to county transport people, but there is an alternative way of doing it. If that link road, which is not actually set in stone as I understand it, it's an indicative access.
Okay,
And I know developers want it.
Perhaps I could just ask a question then for the purposes of the wording of the plan. Is there any concern that by specifying those projects it would exclude other solutions if they became additional, or other solutions if they became if it became apparent through the master planning process or any other process that they would be preferable?
I think we're always open to alternative solutions. This is a solution, and we feel it's the best solution at the moment. If developers or others come up with other solutions which are better but provide the same outcomes, then we would consider those, and they could be included. So the main thing from our perspective that is key to the whole plan is the delivery of the sustainable transport corridors across the whole Garden town. Without those, we believe the plan would not be sound. So those are really the backbone. The other improvements, we're open to be proven as to how essential they actually are and whether there are alternatives, but we believe that what we've got at the moment gives a really good balance of access and also sustainable transport across the various corridors. The improvements, for instance, that have been mentioned down 2nd Avenue are not just capacity improvements, they are walking, cycling and public transport improvements built into those as well. So they are a bit bigger than maybe the field that's been included in the plan, just purely for that purpose as they continue to be developed and moved forwards.
Can you perhaps offer a comment on that?
Certainly. As I read it, the policy requirement says including, which doesn't preclude other things coming forward. So I think we're comfortable that there is still flexibility. We've taken the point on East Harlow, given the comments from Mr. Sprunt, but I think on the other sites it doesn't stop other solutions coming forward.
Thank you. Mr. Stamp, did you just want to finish your point?
Yes, I mean, thanks for the clarification. Other things can come forward. Just can we please get something in there about it's including mention of sustainable transport links to the tube network. We know there's a differential in price between the tube and the overground. People even from Roydon will travel to Epping or Loughton to get on the tube, and not having that in there as a list of requirements when from the vision and the studies it seems to be something which is very highly desirable, if not essential. Getting a sustainable transport corridor along the B1393 would seem to be appropriate to actually include in there. If viability it doesn't happen, I'm assuming it's not going to, at least we've got it then in the policy.
Just if I could just come back briefly, I mean, the council would essentially support that. It is already in the IDP. It's just whether we can avoid being too prescriptive about the measures. Certainly we are looking to include measures to promote sustainable transport between the Garden Town and Epping as in order to avoid congestion and additional car parking in Epping. So we support the principle. It's just a question of whether it requires anything further to be added to the policy.
Thank you. Mr. Mould.
A lot's been discussed about the transport links from the north of Harlow, but from the south end of Harlow, trying the Water Lane area.
Oh, sorry. Microphone.
Yes, so a lot's been discussed about the transport links in the M11, etc. But very little has been said about the Water Lane area, which is going to take, I believe, 2,200 properties in this development. And the roads leading out from the Water Lane area are all B roads. Whereas the road which goes from Harlow to Epping has been declassified as a B road. At one time it wasn't a road. So it's a reasonable road to travel through, even though it's congested. But the roads that come away heading south out of Harlow are literally B roads. They are so narrow that I've seen lorries, 44-tonne lorries, actually stop, putting their wing mirrors in to pass one another. We're talking about country lanes, and we want to put 2,200 houses in this area. They're not going to be going towards the M11. They're going to be going down towards the North Circular Road, which takes them through Waltham Abbey, through Chingford in that direction. And these roads are just inadequate. We seriously need some proper infrastructure to accommodate this large volume of housing.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that point, I mean, that's one of the main concerns of the residents that we've spoken to in Harlow about the lack of infrastructure and the timing of that. Now, I happen to live just by Southern Way, and this gentleman's right. Although there's a lot of traffic going out of the town to the west, it's quite clear that the route from sort of Hoddesdon to the M11 junction has increased dramatically in the last 10 years, mainly of lorries. The sort of thing that's being proposed for Southern Way, which is explained as traffic calming, really that beggars belief, to be frank. It's not part of the actual sustainable transport corridor, and residents living along there, in fact the south side of the town, are very concerned particularly about the Water Lane development and the 2,000 houses, the transport of children from those areas into the school that's being built in the middle of Harlow, and people coming from the Latin Priory site. Fact is that I don't think anybody in this room can actually accurately detail where people travel across the town if they want to go to the retail park or the cinema and all these other services. The transport corridor helps some people, but for the majority of people we've spoken to, quite frankly, the word that's being used is you couldn't make this plan up.
Thank you. Did the council and the county council want to offer any last comments on that before we move on to the green belt? Thank you, Mr. Brunt.
We have done quite a lot of work with regard to the Water Lane, because we have been aware of the concerns of residents, particularly of the Southern Way area, and how the development would have an effect on that particular route. And whilst I mentioned traffic calming, it's a whole host of transport measures that we would look to put along the Southern Way corridor, but also to improve the Second Avenue corridor, linking through to the Abercrombie junction, which is further along there, and down towards the Catherine's junction, which serves Water Lane. So it's looking at a whole host of measures to make the alternative route a route which people, if they do need to use their cars, is an attractive one to use. And Southern Way is not an attractive one because of other measures that we would put in, say not just traffic calming, but a whole host of measures, from more crossings, speed limits, and so on. So there's a lot of measures that can go in along Southern Way to deter its usage as an attractive route. So it's trying to build up a combination of things. And we do feel that the sustainable transport corridor, which would reach into those, will provide for a substantial number of journeys out of those areas.
Thank you. Okay, a last point from Mr. Mould, and then I'm going to move on.
Well, this is not really addressing the issue of traffic coming out of Harlow. This is traffic travelling within Harlow. Fine, they can improve the road system there. But as I'm saying, when you come out of Harlow from the north end and south end and travel south, there just aren't any roads. They are country lanes. I mean, one road is called the Crooked Mole, which I think speaks for itself. It's just inadequate. It needs a proper road system put in down that side. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to the points there on the green belt before coming on to the individual sites. So we have here, and I'll ask this question in relation to all of the sites that are allocated in the plans when we come on to the places policy, but this is the effect on the green belt purposes. Now, the first bullet point is just a discussion of the context, in the context of the balance of harm versus benefit, in the context of whether exceptional circumstances exist to justify the greenbelt alterations as required by paragraph 83 of the NPPF. And then there are a couple of specific issues that have arisen. So the fact that the greenbelt boundary at Latin Priory appears to cut across the master plan area, is that a defensible boundary? and what is the reason for it. And then there's the question of the Water Lane area and the effect on Old House Lane, and whether the need for mitigation should be included within the policy. So if the council could address all of those, and then we'll go around. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. The first question, in terms of balance of harm versus benefit and exceptional circumstances. The Council considers that the need to promote sustainable patterns of development to meet objectively assessed needs over the plan period can only be achieved with the release of land from the Greenbelt. Failing to deliver development to meet those needs would not contribute to the achievement of sustainable development in accordance with national planning policy. It therefore considers that the Greenbelt release is justified and required in order to facilitate wider strategic development goals in the housing market area in relation to development proposed around Harlow. Section 4 of the Sustainability Appraisal of Strategic OAHN Spatial Options 2016 by the work by AECOM, which is EB 203, states that the reuse of brownfield land to support regeneration within Harlow was maximised before the council looked at the most appropriate sites within the Greenbelt. The Gilston Garden Town strategic allocation was formerly located in the Greenbelt, has now been found sound at the examination of the East Herts District Local Plan, which, as you know, has now been adopted. In terms of the justification for the boundary at Latten Priory cutting across the master plan area, the proposed delineation of the Greenbelt boundary such that it runs across the master plan area is justified. It provides a clear policy boundary within which built development will be acceptable, reflecting the ridgeline beyond which built development would detract from the landscape setting of Harlow. The rationale for such an approach is set out within the site selection report at page B1094 of Appendix B1.6. That's EB 805P. Such a judgment is consistent with the recommendations made by AECOM in the Harlow Strategic Site Assessment 2016. That is EB 1500, page 44 to 45. Also Appendix 2 of that document, which is pages 255 to 258. In relation to the need to mitigate the effect of Greenbelt harm arising at Water Lane area on Old House Lane, it is important to clarify that in Greenbelt terms, Broadley Common and housing at Old House Lane are not defined as towns, and therefore concerns regarding coalescence under Purpose 2 of the Greenbelt are not applicable. It is considered that development of the Water Lane master plan area may impact upon the identity of Broadley Common or Old House Lane, and it is recognised that development here would bring the urban footprint of Harlow closer to Broadley Common. However, Policy SP3, Part AX, contains protection for existing adjacent communities and states, development proposals must reflect and demonstrate that the following place-shaping principles have been adhered to with respect to the scale of development proposed. Point 10 is to ensure positive integration and connection with adjacent rural and urban communities, thereby contributing to the revitalisation of existing neighbourhoods. The issue will also be addressed as part of the strategic master planning, and full regard will be had to the existing settlements of Broadley Common and Old House Lane in order to protect the character and identity of these areas. The Harlow and Gilston Garden Town Design Guide references this at pages 31 and 32, and that document is EB 1406. Thank you.
So just before we move on, just so that I'm clear, is the council's position then in relation to the Water Lane matter is that it's not a green belt purpose issue, it's more a local character issue?
Yes, that's correct.
And why was that? Because the points of coalescence, it applies to towns?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any comments on those, please? Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Madam. It is ironic, I think, that Epping Forest District Council planners have recently refused consent because a site which was infill, brownfield, was in the Metropolitan Greenbelt, when you can stand on that site and 1 kilometre away see the ridge on which this development is to be over green fields. So my point is this: when Harlow was developed, and I know as I was a manufacturer in Harlow, I knew a lot about the then Development Corporation and how it was designed. The idea was it was a saucer and that the roof lines of Harlow would remain below that. This development is on a ridge. This is the Latin Priory development. Dorrington Farm, by the way, is at the peak of it. It's 110 metres. It varies 110, 109, right away across to Junction 7. If you were to be in the area of the development, you would dominate the green belt, which comes up roughly to where Latin Priory itself is. And furthermore, I'm grateful to the gentleman over there referring to the AECOM report, because it reminded me, in fact on page 258, which you mentioned, that they say the plateau at the top of the ridge should not be developed, as this would have the potential to result in significant effects on the local landscape and views. New development should therefore be set down on the northern, that's the Harlow side of the ridge, such that the roof line is below the top of the plateau. I feel that the site is not appropriate. I have nothing against that number of houses, but not on the ridge and not in the green belt. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Certainly the Epping Society would support all that's just been said. We do not consider that the case has been made at all for developing in the green belt, and it cannot be made because Epping Forest Council has not looked at the density of development in the various existing communities in Epping Forest and indeed in Harlow. We argue that unless you look at the densities of the existing communities, you cannot tell whether there is scope for increasing the density within the existing communities. And until you've looked at that, you can't tell whether you need to use any green belt. It is our observation, we do not have the resource to do this ourselves. We can't go around measuring large areas of the town ourselves and counting houses, counting numbers of people, etc. Epping Forest Council does have the resource and ought to have done it. We asked for this data from LDF Consult during the consultation period, and they told us this data does not exist. They do not have it. They gave us proxies which are inadequate proxies, namely the number of council taxpayers and so on. That is not an adequate proxy because you need to break down by area of the town and know the actual geographic extent of the town where these council taxpayers are to know what the actual density is of a particular part of any one of the communities. This work has not been done, so it's impossible for the council to say that there is a need to build on the Greenbelt. Another point about the Greenbelt which we would like to make strongly is we do feel that any of those facilities which are permitted to be constructed in the Greenbelt, including schools, hospitals and sports facilities, cemeteries as well, I believe, ought to be identified in the plan as such. Epping Forest Council has a history in the past of arranging with the county to build houses, schools on the Greenbelt, which is a permitted activity, and then to build houses on the site of the old school. It happened in Epping. That is proxy building on the Greenbelt. It shouldn't be done in a dishonest way like that. If you want to take another 20 hectares of Greenbelt, be honest and say so up front so the public can understand what's happening. To say you're taking a certain amount of Greenbelt, oh, and we might need to build a school somewhere, and that will then be additional Greenbelt take, undermines public confidence in the process. It very much upsets the public, and it is not an honest way of going about a plan. So we would say that is very important indeed.
Thank you, Mr Smith. Mr Stamp, then Mr Bolton, please.
Thank you. Two main aspects in terms of Greenbelt. One, sprawl into countryside, encroachment on the countryside. Completely agree with Councillor Jackson's quote from the ACOM study, and the page 260 of the ACOM study, EB1500, actually shows views from town centre in Harlow, the water gardens, which I did actually refer to and got some comment from Mr Hill last time. There are views from Harlow out and from outside in. The water gardens, which is actually in front of Harlow Civic Offices now, the Civic Square, they are listed grade 2, and the 20th Century Society mentions the features of those in particular. And then the south side of the Civic Square was left open, and is still open, to offer views across the gently rolling countryside towards Epping, with the neighbourhoods of houses within Harlow just visible amongst the trees. That's the view from the Harlow side. From the Epping side, the water tower is precisely on the ridge at about 108, 109 metres. The spot height on the middle of the ridge, which is about the boundary of the Latin Priory, southern boundary of the site, is 110. If anyone looks at the Garden Town Vision document, which came out recently, page 13 has a profile drawing along the bottom showing from Gilston, the town centre, and Rye Hill, with heights and buildings and the views you can see out of Harlow and looking back as well, which is actually wrong. It reckons the water tower and some rather oversized outer scale trees are 80 metres above. No, they are actually near enough 110. The water tower is right at the top of the hill, logically, to get the most volume of water, and they do pump from the reservoirs into the water tower to go back down to Harlow. So that is wrong. The southern edge, the existing edge of the build to, I think, line they call it in the submission for Hallam Land Management, shows clearly they intend to have residential development within the green belt, just outside the green belt, it's currently in the green belt, up to that edge. They claim there's a clearly defined and defensible boundary there, which, with a lot of augmented planting, you might make up. If you look at actually Google Maps, Google Earth, there is currently little defensible boundary there. It is a particularly obvious area of encroachment into the green belt and the landscape, whereas other places in the Harlow Garden towns, to a lesser or greater extent, have, particularly north, done pretty well in using the landscape, existing and proposed, to hide the development. Water Lane to the southwest of Harlow is making some attempts by spatial planning to make a decent gap. Slightly, they're still trying east of Harlow, but south of Harlow, Latin Priory particularly, they aren't. The second point in terms of this, and sorry, I'm actually only got the new NPPF, but I think I checked the wording last night, it's pretty much the same. It's now paragraph 138, I can't remember the old paragraph, sorry, I think it's 83, about when drawing up greenbelt boundaries. Where it's been concluded, it's necessary to release greenbelt land for development. Plan should give first consideration to land which has been previously developed and or is well served by public transport. And I would suggest, in terms of Latin Priory, it isn't currently, whereas there are options which are very well served by public transport. And one of the earlier sessions, I'll just pick out.
I don't want to go back to public transport discussion now, particularly. Mr. Stanford.
No, okay, all I wanted to say, what I was going to say was, in terms of well served by public transport, obviously there is a large area of land east of Faden Boyce Station, which is bang next door to a tube line. And within the Garden Towns area, if you need to put a lot of development in that location, I can understand, the Gilston Park Estate reckoned 55% of its area was theoretically developable. They were proposing to develop 34%. The main difference being what they call Hunston Airfield, without wishing to take all of that area, to keep some more trees there. That is a place which is close to Harlow Town Station and will be part of a pretty well established, or will be a good sustainable transport route round there, serving a lot of development, therefore likely to be developer funded. And in terms of areas which don't impinge on the green belt, or if they're going to, are close to existing public transport, I've given one and one, but so there's now two examples, which would be far better in terms of green belt than Latin Priory, if that's understandable.
Thank you. Mr. Bolton.
Thank you. The point I was going to make in direct response to your question about the impact on the Greenbelt, I looked at the Greenbelt Assessment Stage 2, that's EB 705A and 705B. And I've replicated those in my submissions to you and then done the scoring system that they've got. And the sites that are being released score between 9 and 14 in terms of their negative impact. The higher the number, the more negative the impact. And when you do the sensitivity test of taking off purpose 3, that goes down to between 6 and 9. Now, when we discussed earlier the overall level of housing need and the need to achieve sustainable development, we agreed, I think, with some of the people around the table, indeed with Epping Forest District Council, that in itself, or those combination of factors, actually did represent at a district level exceptional circumstances in order to alter the Greenbelt boundary. Now, those have to be also demonstrated on a site-by-site basis. But it seems to me that where one has a large sites like this, you are going to have a fairly large impact on the purposes of the Greenbelt, as is demonstrated. But where there is a will, if you like, to secure sustainable development, what the allocation of these sites demonstrate is that a fairly serious impact on the Greenbelt can be justified and mitigated, and other infrastructure issues can also be mitigated and overcome. But even doing that, we're not meeting the OAN, and we're definitely not meeting the OAN in the short term, as was demonstrated yesterday. And so it's worth recalling, if you like, that there are other smaller sites which can, if you like, fill in to meet the OAN, which would have a lesser impact on the Greenbelt. Now, I'm not suggesting that those smaller sites should be developed instead of the strategic sites, but that they both would form what would actually be a justified strategy for the provision of housing within the district and be able to meet the full OAN and also be able to meet that in the short term as well as the long term. It seems to me that impact on the Greenbelt, and just for an example, the peer group site, which is SR0269, actually scores 5 as opposed to 9 and 14, and 1.5 as opposed to 6 or 9. Now, much smaller sites, so of course it's, well, not of course, but it does score less. But it goes to show that there are options there for the council to actually use these strategic sites as part of a comprehensive plan in order to meet its OAN in the full. And in doing so, in Greenbelt terms, would not be having any greater impact on the Greenbelt than has already been accepted in these cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. We'll hear from Mr. Taylor, Mr. Barber, Mr. Hill, and then I want to move on to the sites themselves. Mr. Taylor.
Yes, I'd just like to agree with some of the earlier comments that were made by the speakers 2 or 3 times ago. Basically, we object to this plan for Latin completely. Of all the sites that are in these joint plans, this is the one that we would have the most objections to. It's one of the only sites where any consultation was taken place with residents. I happened to go along to that consultation and didn't speak to anybody that was in favour of this development, who really wanted to see the green belt destroyed. What's effectively being proposed here is a housing estate in the middle of a field, right on the edge of Harlow. Somewhere within the documents before you, it says that this can't be seen from Epping because it's 2.3 miles away. Well, it might not be able to be seen from Epping, but it can certainly be seen from Harlow, as has been described earlier on. So we certainly object to this site in particular, for all the reasons that's been said a bit earlier on. Thank you.
Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mum. Just a couple of points in respect to these questions. To begin with, land west of Harlow did feature in Gibbard's own intentions for the expansion of Harlow back in his 1974 plan. And therefore, the idea of expanding Harlow to the west is not a new one. In respect of Old House Lane, we would agree with the Council's position that this is a matter that can be addressed through the Strategic Master Plan, particularly given the character of that part of the Water Lane allocation, land north of Water Lane. There is part of the site which is characterised by large-scale, almost industrial scale glass houses, and therefore has a very different character to other proposed allocations. We'll come on to more specific matters in due course, but they're the points I want to make now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, ma'am. Dealing firstly with the balance point and applying the Calverton tests, we would say that need is plainly acute in this area. Previously developed land is plainly scarce in Epping Forest, and greenbelt release is unavoidable. Whilst one might regret that, it is unavoidable. And for Councillor Jackson to say not in the greenbelt is simply not achievable. I'm afraid Epping Forest has got no other option but to release the tracts of land that it's identified. And of course, proper planning demands that one locates a substantial proportion of the new housing to be built next to a large urban area like Harlow with existing infrastructure, facilities and its existing public transport opportunities, cycleways, footways, which no doubt you'll have seen on the ground as you have familiarised yourself with the area. And as we've said in our reps, and I won't repeat them here, we believe Latin Priory is the best area to locate additional housing immediately adjoining the urban area of Harlow. Moving on to the second point, the boundary issue, ma'am, which you flagged up, and I think that flows from our original representations and subsequent hearing statement. The starting point is paragraph 85, which you'll be very familiar with, and the need when defining boundaries to do so clearly using physical features that are readily recognisable and likely to be permanent. It isn't a test we've devised, that is the test that the government have devised. And we regret in this respect that the councils have taken the approach that they want to identify the boundary along a ridge line. As you will see when you go on site, if you haven't been out there already, there is simply not a clear physical feature here to represent the greenbelt boundary. It's simply not there. Whereas a little further to the south and to the east, there are substantial, well-developed belts of vegetation, trees, some depth in places, which seem to us to offer a sensible, clear, long-term new greenbelt boundary. So again, we'd invite you to look at those on the ground. If you've got our master plan sketch layout to hand, which was submitted as one of the appendices to our hearing statement, ma'am, I think it's Appendix 2 to our hearing statement. Ma'am, do you have that broadly like that? You can see the existing belts of vegetation are shown there, and along the southern part of the site, and then there is a gap, but roughly where the word sang is placed, and then you see another substantial belt heading due north. So we invite you to look at that on the ground and to compare the opportunities that those belts afford with the ridgeline that the council have alighted upon, which is simply not visible in any way, shape or form on the ground when one is on site. I want to make it absolutely plain, ma'am, that there's no intention, however, on the part of the promoters to propose or promote development beyond or to the south of the council's line. And we accept that drawing the line there does protect views from Latin Priory and the sweep of country to the south. We're not seeking to push the boundary of the developed area further to the south. We're simply looking to identify a sensible set of features that would support the new Greenbelt boundary. Last point, ma'am, again something you'll see on site, we are struggling to see the prominence given to views from Harlow Town Centre by some of those around the table, over 2.5 kilometres away to the north. And again, you'll have to judge that yourself, ma'am, on site. Even if that were considered to be a significant point when Harlow was originally developed and laid out post-war, priorities have changed, and the meeting of housing needs, urgent acute housing needs in a sustainable location must, in our view, take precedence over partial views from an urban centre some considerable way to the north. Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Jackson, I know you've got your board up, but I did say we were going to stop there, so we are, because I know you want to speak on Latin Priory, and I want to get onto that. So if I could just ask the council to comment on any of those points that it wishes, particularly perhaps the Greenbelt boundary at Latin Priory, before we then move on.
Yes, thank you, Madam. The council gave very careful consideration to the line of the boundary. As Mr. Coleman mentioned earlier, the ACOM study in 2016 of the strategic site assessment was undertaken, and that included a specific appraisal, landscape appraisal of that site, because we knew that it was very sensitive. As a result of that, the boundary that's been drawn up on here takes account of that advice, and we would contend that it is a clear line that would form a permanent defensible boundary. As a result of the landscape sensitivity of the site, we did have proposed that development should be limited to the northern part of the site, with development not extending beyond that identified ridgeline. That ridgeline is in fact the historic planned extent of Harlow, the origins of which date back to the original Gibbard plan. And we do feel that limiting development to the area north would prevent visual harm. I've heard obviously what Mr. Hill has said about no intention, but we think the better way to protect that for the long term is by locating the Greenbelt boundary along that ridge line. That has also been subject to member and other site visits subsequently to confirm that in drawing up the local plan, and obviously taking into account the consultation responses that we received to the draft local plan consultation. I think it is worth pointing out that this allocation was in the draft local plan as well, so it was the subject of extensive consultation at that stage as well as being included. It's not something that's new. Just picking up a couple of the other points, just to emphasise that the council is not proposing, as part of the proposed alterations to Greenbelt, to take schools out of the Greenbelt. That is a discussion that we've been having with Essex County Council. We're not proposing to do that. And just to reiterate that the settlement capacity study, which we've talked about previously, looked to see whether or not there were other sites within settlements that could be brought forward as part of the plan. And we have sought to bring forward as many sites within settlements as have been available and we consider to be achievable and deliverable.
Thank you. So we'll move on to Latin Priory. There's a new face at the table. Mr. Lowry, thank you. Okay, so if we begin with Latin Priory, I think I said just before we broke for lunch that it would be helpful, I think, and if we can keep it fairly brief, but if you can do it with the questions that I have in mind, although some of them are quite specific, I think it would be useful if we could just have a general overview of each allocation, talk a bit about the land ownership, the progress that's been made, any known issues or constraints. If we hear from the council first and then from whoever's promoting the site, and then I'll take comments around the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Just a very short introduction to Latin Priory from the Council's perspective. A number of meetings have been held with key stakeholders, including the District Council, the main site promoters, who you'll hear from shortly, Commercial Estates Group and Hallam Land, also with Essex County Council, both in terms of highways and education, and also Harlow District Council. Strategic Master Plan has been is being developed and was subject to a first review by the Quality Review Panel in October 2018. It's due to have a second review next month in April 2019. Planning Performance Agreement was signed in August 2018 between Epping Forest District, Harlow District Council, Essex County Council, Commercial Estates Group and Hallam Land. And the express purpose of that planning performance agreement is to ensure that resources are, and a project programme is in place to progress the strategic master plan as quickly as possible. Communication is also ongoing with the 3 smaller land promoters within the master plan area, which includes Dorrington Farm, which we've been discussing. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hill or Mr. Newton?
Thank you, ma'am. I shall be quick, particularly as Mr. Coleman stolen some of my thunder. But focusing on the 3 issues, ma'am, that you've specifically identified on your agenda. Land ownership, as you have heard, unusually for a site of this very considerable size, the vast majority of it is in the ownership of one family, and it is promoted for development by CEG and Hallam Land, 2 very experienced promoters who jointly control the site and have done so since 2005. Second, in relation to progress, I can confirm all that Mr. Coleman has said, that the planning performance agreement's been in place since August of last year, and that we've had a first quality review, a second quality review planned in the next couple of weeks in pursuit of agreeing a strategic master plan so that that's ready for consultation. I think you will have seen in relation to our Matter 6 statement that Mr. Newton was here to speak to, that various milestones and trajectory expectations are set out in our Matter 6 statement. I'm not going to repeat any of that. The form of development is largely settled, and that has been the subject of discussion with the stakeholders referred to by Mr. Coleman, who have included the specialist offices of the Council and Essex County Council's Highways team, and our application is expected to follow those development parcels. The access strategy principles have been agreed. Ma'am, you will also seen that work has been advancing on site capacity, and further to your question, back in February in respect of Matter 4, we've now produced a detailed note showing that one can indeed deliver 1,500 units without deviating from the expected development parcels, 1 jot, at an average density of 37.5 dwellings per hectare. Third and last, any particular issues or constraints to refer to? I'm just going to mention 2. One is heritage and one is the Sang issue. Latin Priory, of course, takes its name from Latin Priory Farm, and the principal heritage asset is, of course, the Priory to the south. But as I've already referred to today, I hope you'll go and see how that sits in the context of the proposed area for development. Very well removed from it, out of sight from it, and with an open setting to the south and heavily screened to the north by an extensive range of large and rather unattractive agricultural buildings. In relation to heritage, work has been underway for at least 10 years looking at the heritage implications of developing on this site, and a full geophysical survey was undertaken in 2008 and submitted to the county archaeologist. Nothing of significance was found. In relation to SANG, my last point, we fully expect a requirement for on-site SANG, and there's more than adequate space to deliver this. And we have had early engagement with Natural England through their design advice service, and they have confirmed that they are satisfied with our emerging SANG strategy. One footnote is that it's a feature of this site and the very extensive ownership that there is the opportunity or potential to provide strategic SANG in conjunction with the on-site SANG for our development. That is, again, something that we're discussing with the local planning authority. And we'll probably come back to that subject, ma'am, in May. So unless I can assist you further, those are just some headline points in relation to the three issues that you raised.
Okay, thank you. As I say, I do have a couple of very specific questions that I want to ask, but I think first of all, if we just hear from others around the table. I know, Mr. Jackson, you might need to leave, so you go first and say what you want to.
That's very kind of him, Madam. First of all, can I just clarify that when I was saying not the green belt, I was talking specifically about Latin Priory. It was then said that there's a scarcity of land. I made the report in my written submission, which you have obviously seen, that there are in these garden communities around Harlow, there is Gilston, where we have proposed 3,000 homes when it is agreed that at some point it can easily reach 10,000. So there is plenty of opportunity. There's plenty of space. The second point, the rest of the points I want to make about specifically here is I did discover, and Ms. Blom-Cooper was very helpful to me, that the original plans I was given had no contours. So it wasn't evident that there was a ridge. She gave me a plan with the contours on it. I also noticed that the documents which show where this development site is, the plan does not include all of Epping Forest. There is a place called Crabs Green. There are numerous other bits of Epping Forest, and some of which actually cross the site. So if I'm talking about the green belt issue, I'm talking about what is in this green belt. And there is, for example, Lower Forest, which isn't an SAC, but is an SSSI, which is only 1.6 kilometres away. There's Crabs Green, which is less than a kilometre away, and there's lots of other bits. So it is a very special bit of green belt that it overlooks. I think that's really all I would like to say, and thank you very much.
Is there any other general point that anyone wants to make before I ask my specific questions on the agenda? Okay, thank you. So the first point concerns the historic environment. So we're looking now at SP 5F6. Now, obviously, I have to give some thought to the modifications that have been suggested earlier. But if I were to accept them and that was a sufficient solution to Historic England's concerns, the council is additionally, I think, proposing a modification to Part 6 here. Firstly, would it be necessary? Would it be necessary to have the wording you've proposed in here if we also have that addition in SP 4?
Sorry, would you like me to comment on that?
Yes, please. Yeah.
I think it would be helpful because I think it will deal with the issue about making sure that the listed buildings are recognised in that policy. I think we've referred to scheduled monuments, our proposed amendment, which is set out and has been agreed indeed with Historic England in their statement of common ground, is to include unlisted buildings to the south of the site, just to make it clear that all the designated heritage assets will be considered as part of the design of any proposals. So we're suggesting to add to point little 6 at the end to delete the words and the scheduled monument, include a sympathetic design which responds to the adjacent ancient woodland, scheduled monuments and listed buildings to the south of the site.
Okay, thank you. And in relation to the other allocations, I think it applies equally here. Is it necessary to identify the heritage assets by name specifically?
Well, we haven't named them specifically. We've just identified the range of heritage assets, and that's, as I say, that was in response to Historic England's objections to the plan and comments, representations on the plan, and included within the final statement of common ground. If you feel that it's not necessary, I don't think we were trying to accommodate as many of their proposed amendments.
And my last question was in relation to the wording you're proposing. I had and this applies to all of the amendments. I had some concern perhaps about the term responds to. I was wondering whether it would be necessary to reference the statutory duty or the wording in the MPPF concerning preserve and enhance and the significance, rather than something that responds to the assets identified.
I don't think we'd have a problem with that.
Anybody else, any comments on that matter? Okay, so if we could reference the statutory duty rather than responds to, and that will apply when we discuss it in relation to all of the other sites as well as a common point. Okay, and then the second point, we've obviously discussed the SANG already. Is it referred to? I don't think it's referred to in the policy. Should it be? I may have missed it.
No, I don't think you've missed it per se. I think we've just referred to it as strategic green infrastructure rather than as a SANG per se. So it is covered to that extent. We're also proposing, when we get to it in May, to amend Policy DM2 to include reference to the mitigation strategy for both recreational pressures and air quality. Although that won't relate to SANG, the actual strategy itself does set out where SANGs, or will set out where SANGs are required within the district.
Thank you, Mum. I think it is really important that the SANGs are referred to specifically in policy. The wording as it is at the moment does suggest multifunctional use and a combination of things that maybe are not necessarily always compatible, for example, commuting. You ask if a SANG is required. The 6.2 buffer, which is identified from the visitor survey work, which is the EB715, that is based on 75% of the interviewees, the distance between the home postcode and the survey point. And that 6.2 boundary does encompass the southern half of Latin Priory, and it also encompasses part of Water Lane. That survey data was collected in October and November, and so maybe perhaps not the optimal time of year. And also that survey data, it's 75%, so there are people coming from outside. And when you look at the actual postcode data and the distribution of those postcodes, there are people visiting Epping Forest at least weekly from Harlow, so from further north of that 6.2. So therefore it is crucial that there is adequate mitigation, and the volume of housing and the shift of housing in that this broad location is such that there is a real risk in combination to the SAC. The City of London Conservators are very keen to ensure that there is the robust protection for Epping Forest SAC, and that needs to be secured in a way that's tightened down. And when you actually scrutinise some of these policy wording and some of the background material, there are some contradictory wording and discrepancies that don't give certainty. I think that we can rule out adverse effects on integrity. For example, in the HRA, paragraph 5.22, and this is EB 209, the most recent HRA, it suggests that Latin Priory and Water Lane deliver or contribute to SANGs, so deliver or contribute to a SANG elsewhere. Then 5.26 in the same HRA says SANGs could also be applied, so there's a could there that's not specific. And then when you look at the interim mitigation strategy, and that's EB 134, the paragraph 27 says that SANG delivery might not be adequate to deliver the necessary mitigation, and that contributions towards on-site measures may be required as well. So I think there is some confusion around what's required for the SANGs, and there is nothing specific to set out the quantum and scale of SANG delivery that is necessary. And we know from the visitor data that SANGs to work needs to be large and high quality. For example, in terms of size, we're looking at visitor routes of the average route for all visitors within the SAC was 3.4 kilometres. That's from EB 715, and to accommodate that kind of route you need close to 100 hectares if it's a pure circle. The average dog walk is 2.2 kilometres. To accommodate that kind of average dog walk with a circular area of green space, you need well over 30 hectares. There's nothing setting out that kind of quality and standard of SANG, and I don't think it is clear and safe to rely on the master planning I think the framework needs to set out what's required in that master planning and what the SANGs need to look like.
Mr. Hill, did you want to come back on that?
Ma'am, I think what I would advise you to do is simply to reserve your position on this particular issue until we get to May, when I think there will be more clarity as to the numerical data. We don't oppose an express reference to SANG in the policy wording, if that's considered appropriate. I think seeking to prescribe the quantum at this stage would be extremely dangerous and inappropriate.
In relation to your last point, seeking to prescribe are you saying that until May, or is that a sort of full stop requirement? Do you think the evidence will be available?
I don't know for sure, but I think we will be on much firmer ground in terms of what the precise quantum might be. We're certainly addressing our mind to it, and the master plan as advanced already factors in a substantial area of SANG. So we're not ignoring it or putting our heads in the sand. We're simply saying that it's one of those points, ma'am, that it would be sensible to put on hold for a couple of months.
Thank you.
Can I just come back on that? I think just to corroborate what Mr. Hill has said, and to say that if we're going to have this conversation, I think Natural England really need to be here and be part of the conversation. I don't think there's any dispute that the SANG is needed on Latin Priory. What we don't know yet is the nature of what else will be required. We're intending to do that by putting into policy the mitigation strategy, because obviously that will change over time. I mean, what is also not being said is that we will be doing an updated visitor survey this summer, and that may well change things yet again. So we need to make sure that we have flexibility and it's not too prescriptive, and that we can, as during the plan period, adjust things as necessary to take account of changing circumstances.
Thank you. Is your ward still up, or is it a separate point? Okay, well, last point then. Thank you.
Thank you. The further visitor surveys and things may well add greater clarity, but I think the point is that at SP5 there needs to be something tighter, setting out a requirement for SANGs and making sure that those are robust enough. And at the moment there isn't enough at all to. There's plenty of scope to tighten that wording up.
Okay. Okay. Well, if we could perhaps put down a marker. But we'll reserve the position on it until May when there's more detail available. But if you can make a note of that. Thank you. Has everyone said everything they want to say for now on Latin Priory? Okay, I think propose a short break perhaps until 3:45, and then we'll come back for the last two sites. Thank you. To discuss the modification proposed to map 2.2 to show the indicative access to Latham Priory. Does anyone have any concerns about that proposed modification? And is the County Council satisfied that that would provide a suitable access? Anyone else? Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on now to the Water Lane area. Again, if the council could just give us an introduction to that allocation, looking at the matters on the agenda, particularly bullet points 1 and the sub-bullet points, and then if we come on to the site promoter after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. In terms of the Water Lane area, several meetings have been held between key stakeholders, including Epping Forest District Council, the main site promoters, Essex County Council Highways and Harlow District Council. Representatives for some of the smaller sites contained within Tyler's Cross have begun to engage in the master planning process, and a statement of common ground has been agreed and signed by all of these land promoters. The Water Lane site master plan area, I'll start that again. The Water Lane allocation site master plan is being jointly presented to the Quality Review Panel on the 28th of March, and the small land promoters, the promoters of the small sites, will be in attendance. Planning Performance Agreement was signed in July 2018 between Epping Forest District Council, Harlow District Council, Essex County Council and Manor Oak Homes regarding West Sumners. Planning Performance Agreement has been agreed and signed by the West Catherines Consortium, however is currently being circulated for relevant signatures from Essex County Council, Harlow District Council and Epping Forest District Council. Thank you.
I wonder whether it might be worth just addressing perhaps the top bullet point here. We talk about this thing is mentioned of the consortium. I don't know whether you feel that's for you to explain or whether that could be for these site promoters to explain. I guess I just want to understand a little bit more about what's happening on both the northern and southern parts. I think I've probably seen more detail on the southern part, is that right? And what just to give me a little bit more confidence about what the master planning process you're talking about actually covers.
Certainly, yeah. It is complicated in terms of the different parcels, but I'll explain what we are doing. So joint meetings have been held between Epping Forest District Council and the promoters for the northern and southern part. So the northern part is West Catherines, the southern part is West Sumners. along with representatives for some of the smaller sites immediately south of Water Lane itself. It's been agreed that a single high-level strategic master plan, as required by policy SP5, will be produced for the entire master plan area. The current draft, which is due to be presented to the Quality Review Panel, as I mentioned, on the 28th of March, has been jointly produced by the promoters of West Sumners and West Catherines. Representatives of some of the smaller sites within Tyler's Cross are aware of the work and will be in attendance at the Quality Review Panel. It's been agreed that the smaller site representatives will feed into the high-level strategic master plan. Site-specific master plans will then be undertaken for each of the respective sites based on the high-level allocation-wide strategic master plan. The recently agreed statement of common ground has been signed by all of these land promoters and shows collaborative working across the entire allocation site. In terms of the consortium, information submitted during the Regulation 18 draft local plan consultation confirms that the West Catherine site is jointly owned by multiple parties who have a formal agreement to work together as the consortium. This is set out on page 91 of the site selection report, Appendix B1.6.4, and that's EB 805N. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Barber?
Thank you, Ma'am. Like my predecessor, I will keep things succinct. Mr. Coleman helpfully has advised you that the consortium, in its broader sense, the north of Water Lane, west of Catherines, west of Sumners, and the smaller sites at Tyler's Cross, formally enter into their quality review panel process a week today. We have been working collaboratively to produce the initial presentation for that meeting. But sitting behind that is a raft of technical information that has been prepared over a number of years. That includes heritage work, landscape, and work in relation to the site's contribution to the Greenbelt. We will continue to work collaboratively through that strategic master plan process, and on the adoption of that strategic master plan, we will then look to promote individual site-based master plans for the purposes of taking forward planning applications.
Thank you. So the master plan that's going to the panel on the 28th of March, that covers the whole...
That covers the whole of the allocation area.
Is that available to see, or when would it be available to see?
We have only just provided it to the consultants who are running the quality review panel process. I think the individual promoters of the particular elements of the sites have submitted to the council various promotion documents over the course of the preparation of the local plan, and they will form part of the evidence base to that plan. So I'm sure they're available if you need them.
Thank you. One question before I forget, before I open the... We had a discussion the other day about the proposed Gypsy and Traveller allocations. Is it intended to be clear about which part of the Water Lane allocation that's within? It's just that it has to be included somewhere, is it? Can I just ask if the master plan is making provision for that?
Ma'am, that will come through the strategic master plan process.
It will, because
Yes.
I asked the people who were here the other day whether there was an intention to work sort of with that or whether there was an objection to it, but it's only...
We have made representations in respect of the methodology behind the requirement, but we are happy to work with it through the master plan process.
Okay, any comments on Water Lane? Till.
Thank you. Just really to confirm that Mr and Mrs Schofield and Mrs Marshall, who own between them approximately 10 acres just to the south of Water Lane, have been working with the other interested parties in relation to the strategic master plan and the work towards the quality review panel meeting next week. We've also been working with the Diocese Board of Finance, Chelmsford Diocese Board of Finance, who own the land directly adjacent to our site, which is part of that kind of middle section, and work is progressing on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Belton.
Thank you, Ma'am. As you know, we don't object to this or any of the other garden community sites. Our interest is just really in the lead-in times to delivery. So just very quickly on that, Mr Newton made reference to the fact that in his hearing statement he'd set out in a little bit of detail the milestone steps between kind of now and all the permissions being granted and their 50 units being delivered by 2023. We didn't take issue with that trajectory that Mr Newton had put forward, although we did observe that it is reasonably tight in places. Given what we've just heard about Water Lane, it sounds to me that Water Lane are perhaps a little bit behind Latin Priory, in that they haven't yet been for the design panel review of the strategic master plan. And if I've understood this correctly, once that master plan is approved, there'll then be a requirement to do site-specific master plans as well. So on the basis that we think the Latin Priory trajectory is ambitious, but not one that we take issue with, we have concerns that if Water Lane are indeed a little behind that, and the trajectory is indicating that they will deliver 100 units in 2023 rather than the 50 units at Latin Priory, it suggests to us that there's, again, a lack of flexibility here, and we would suggest that the trajectory should assume delivery at Water Lane is pushed back by at least 12 months, if not more, and that would obviously need to be reflected in the wider trajectory.
Thank you. I'll take a couple of other points and then perhaps get the promoters to come back on that. Mr Lowry.
I do apologise for being so woefully behind speed. I hear mention of a quality review panel. Please, where can information about this group be found? Their remit, constituents, are they democratic? Do they publish agendas and minutes, please?
Thank you. Mr Mould.
As there's no specific plans for this, other than a broad outline, excuse me, I've no comment on the actual development of the land. I want to come back to the concern that the roads are just totally inadequate for 2,000 houses. Thank you.
Mr Taylor.
Yes, I spoke earlier on about the lack of consultation when it came to Latin Priory. Things here in respect to these two sites forming Water Lane is far, far worse than that. The only consultation we've come across took place in about 2012-13 with regard to the Summers part of this, and quite clearly residents came along to that and expressed their views. One of the assurances at that time was that none of the access, well, the only accesses would be from outside of the existing Harlow estates. We have seen something recently that might suggest that that isn't the case. Secondly, with regard to the north side, there's been absolutely no public consultation with residents in Harlow in any shape or form. When we started to approach residents whose gardens literally back onto this proposal, None of them had ever heard of this. It's never been promoted anywhere in Harlow at all. And there's a lot of and growing opposition to these plans. As I said at the beginning of this, when I spoke earlier on, the Conservative group in Harlow is clearly against the Sumners part of this plan, and we'll be speaking very much against that when it comes into the council chamber in Harlow and at the local plan stage as well for Harlow. So really we are concerned about the local consultation, or lack of it, which has got steadily worse as we've gone through these areas. Thank you.
Okay, if we first could ask the council perhaps to respond to Mr. Lowry about the remit of the quality review panel. We have discussed this earlier on the agenda, but Mr. Lowry possibly wasn't here.
Yes, indeed, Madam. The terms of reference of the quality review panel for both Epping Forest District Council and indeed for the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town are available on our website. If you go to the planning policy section and then look under quality review panel, you'll see information about it, and you can download the terms of reference, which includes the panel members and the way in which they undertake reviews.
Again, I don't know whether or not, I know Harlow, I did ask you this earlier, but I don't know if you're able to say anything more about how an understanding of the sort of beyond the Harlow boundary allocations has been promoted within Harlow itself in response to Mr. Taylor's comment.
Thank you, ma'am. As I said earlier, the emerging proposals within Harlow have been consulted upon through the various stages of our local plan in accordance with our adopted SCI, Statement of Community Involvement. We're aware, however, that developers have previously have been undertaking informal consultation with residents for the development sites within Epping, which obviously they're at liberty to do. But obviously in terms of the formal consultation on the development sites within Epping obviously have taken place through their consultation process. But as I say, obviously with the change of developers, and there has been a bit of hiatus, I believe, I think the engagement process that the developers pursued has been different. But as I say, we consulted on the developments within Harlow in accordance with our due process, which is standard practice and obviously conforms with our statement of community involvement. But as I say, we had acknowledged that there was likely to be development outside Harlow as part of the wider growth proposals, which reflects the growth in the SHMA, which has been prepared on behalf of all three councils, well in actual fact Knutlesford as well, going back to the original work when that commenced.
Thank you, Madam. I just wanted to clarify a few points, if I may, about the consultation and engagement process. I think Mr. Taylor referred to previous engagement or consultation that would have been undertaken by the promoters, not by the councils. Obviously, we have consulted through the draft local plan, as I mentioned earlier, about the proposed allocations. We also have, I mentioned this document earlier, it's EB 133, which is the Strategic Master Planning Process Briefing Note, and it sets out requirements for the production of the master plans, which are being adhered to by the developers and the promoters through the work that they're doing, and that includes community and stakeholder engagement, and it sets out requirements and principles for engagement activities across Harlow and across Epping in some detail. So whilst there hasn't been consultation on the master plans yet, that will follow shortly, and that's just a matter of time due to the stage in the process they're at. But there is within that document there is quite a helpful there's quite a helpful diagram that shows the various stages in the process that need to be gone through which include the engagement and consultation. That's on page 3 of the document. And that does include engagement with stakeholders and parish and town councils.
And would that include stakeholders across the administrative boundary? Because I think the concern that we're having is that obviously you've consulted residents in Epping, consulted residents in Harlow, but where there's a cross-boundary issue, perhaps it's not been as direct, even if there was some opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. This note makes very clear the requirements need to go across boundary, and they need to accord with both the Epping Forest and Harlow statements of community involvement. So absolutely, and this has been developed through joint working with Harlow Council.
What was the reference for that document again? 1133?
EB 133.
133. Thank you.
Just to guide or to help you when you do come to look at it, it's part of a report to Cabinet. So it comes after the report itself as an appendix, but it's set out within there. It's also on the website separately, I think.
Thank you. And did either Mr. Barber and or Ms. Hill want to come back on the comments made by Mr. Belton regarding the trajectory? And I don't know if there's anything more both of you can say to provide confidence that the trajectory as outlined in the implementation strategy is accurate and deliverable.
Thank you, ma'am. I will just make a brief comment. I mean, clearly we are dependent on the progress of the plan, given the Greenbelt status of the sites in question. And therefore, we rely on the plan coming forward in a timely manner to enable us to progress the work necessary in relation to applications. But that work is ongoing and it will continue through the strategic master plan process and beyond. And it's our every intention to meet the aspirations of that trajectory.
Yes, as I mentioned, Mr. and Mrs. Schofield and Mrs. Marshall are smaller landowners within the allocation site, and the larger parties are, it's fair to say, much more advanced in terms of technical work they've done. But I don't feel that this is going to frustrate the process. The overriding strategic master plan that is being prepared and is going to be reviewed next week can carry forward. And this site is different to the other allocations around Harlow in that it's got 3 distinct areas. So all 3 areas can come forward separately once the strategic master plan is in place. I can't foresee that there's going to be a problem in delivering the number of houses within the trajectory as it stands.
And could either the council or the county council come back on Mr. Mould's concerns, please?
I think it's important to note that obviously through the progression of the allocations and the plan itself, we continue to work with stakeholders, but most notably we've been in discussions with Harlow District Council about some of the access arrangements and principles for the planning and delivery of both Blatton Priory and Water Lane sites. There is a document that has been submitted to the examination library, which is ED21, which is a statement of principles relating to the planning and delivery of the Blatton Priory and Water Lane sites. And this has, as I said, been developed closely with officers from Harlow, and it sets out a number of general principles which will help to guide the strategic master plan process, particularly around access arrangements, both into Harlow and out of the site, for both sites, I should say, for both sites. So I hope that gives some comfort in terms of the ongoing work that's undertaken. I might need to ask Mr. Sprunt to come back on any detail in terms of the roads themselves.
I've got nothing specific to add at the moment. I haven't been involved in those conversations to date, so in due course I will obviously be as the master plans progress.
Can you give any comfort to Mr. Mould that these issues are being considered? They've been considered as part of the wider transport strategy. That sort of.
We've certainly had concerns about where traffic will go from these sites, and that's been all part of the overall planning of the Garden Town and the various proposals that we've put forward as part of the overall strategy. So that has been part of that. Obviously, it now gets down to the more detailed site-specific detail, which will actually help guide the traffic to the improvements that we're looking at in the wider town. There's also obviously through these sites the sustainable transport corridor link as well, which is going to be really important for delivering certainly the water lane sites through all of these three separate allocations that form water lane.
Thank you. So hear from Mr. Mould, Mr. Taylor, and then Mr. Belton again.
Well, I hate to state the obvious here, but I think these two gentlemen haven't made any attempt to put in some decent infrastructure regarding the roads. Any transportation system, the buses don't exist. Nothing. It's a rural area. They haven't answered my question at all.
Well, do you take any comfort from the proposals we've been hearing about these sustainable transport corridors? What are your concerns
None
about
whatsoever.
the operation of those?
None whatsoever, because it's all dealing with the north side of Harlow. Nothing at all the south end. Sumners and Catherine's, it stops there. That's the boundary of Harlow, and it stops, as far as I can make out.
The sustainable transport corridor goes through all of these sites to the west, so it does serve all of these. And whilst there's no bus services at the moment, clearly that's the whole purpose of developing the sustainable transport corridor, is that there will be new bus services, walking and cycling facilities and so on that link all these sites together and provide that infrastructure.
I think if we deal with realities, the vast majority of people, and I can speak for people here, we travel by car. How many cycle and walk?
Thank you, Mr. Mould. Let's hear from Mr. Taylor.
Perhaps refer you to Harlow Council's statement of community involvement, which is dated September 2014, which sets out how they should consult on planning issues. And there's a whole list including things like surveys and questionnaires, leaflets and posters, exhibitions. And to give an example, they did none of those with regard to Harlow's local plan, let alone what's happening around Harlow. This is very much our case that we're going to be making in the next couple of weeks to the local inspector in Harlow. Quite clear, they ignored virtually all of these.
Just say I'm not going to get involved in what the inspector in Harlow will consider about their processes. I am interested to the extent that you've been involved in the Epping sites, but I'm not going to get involved at all in
the point
what happened in Harlow.
So then the point I was going to make is these sites have sort of fallen through the grate as far as Harlow residents are concerned. The Epping Council haven't got a legal duty to consult with people in Harlow, and Harlow Council didn't have a legal duty to consult with people about these things around Harlow, and it's fallen through the grate. So as an example, the Catherines, nobody's consulted the residents of Harlow about those.
Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Ma'am. I just wanted to come back on the point of sustainable transport. That work is ongoing. It is collaborative work, and it will continue through the master plan process. And that work will look at achievement of the sustainable transport corridors, sustainable transport in general, and how that can form part of the emerging schemes as we develop them. Thank you.
And Mr. Belton, before I come back to the council and then move on to east of Harlow.
Just very briefly on the trajectory point. In Mr. Newton's statement, it's the bullet points under paragraph 1.22, if you wanted to look at that. The reason I'm just referring you to those bullet points is that Mr. Newton assumes that to deliver housing in 2023, that requires an outline application to be submitted in Q3 of this year. My sense is that in the case of Water Lane, an outline application isn't going to be ready by Q3 of this year, and if there is a delay to that, it would seem to me that delivery in 2023 is unrealistic. But while we're all around the table, it might be a good opportunity if the interested parties could confirm if an outline application is likely to be ready to submit on that type of timeline.
Mr. Barber, did you want to comment on that?
Ma'am, I can comment in that at least in one element of the allocation, an outline application is likely to be prepared this year.
Are you going to say more about consultation? Because I want to ask, I don't think we'll get anywhere by hearing more about it. I understand the point. I just want to ask the council to come back on. Okay, last point then, Mr. Leverett.
I'm coming back on the sustainable transport. I've got to agree with Councillor Colin Mould because his talk, what's been missed here, they keep saying the sustainable transport corridor, that goes to the east, but the amount of traffic going to the west is what Councillor Colin Moulds is on about. There's no provision for that. The roads are not capable of taking that from these developments. So I think that's really got to be considered as to how they're going to cope, because there'll be a lot of transport going that way, which is not necessarily going to use, people are going to use the sustainable transport, unless they extend the sustainable transport elsewhere.
Thank you. Okay, Council, just come back on those points.
Thank you. Just briefly, Madam. I have mentioned already, but just to reiterate, there has been consultation on Garden Town documentation by way of the vision and design guide, and that's been across administrative areas. It's been in Epping, in Harlow and in East Herts, and that was taking place last summer. And there will be ongoing consultation with local residents and stakeholders as further work progresses. There's also been consultation on the draft local plan, and I referred you earlier to our consultation statement, showing that we have gone to ensure that we have consulted within Harlow on our draft local plan. So we think that has been an important part of the consultation process, and ensuring consultation with residents in Harlow. In terms of the highways concerns, I absolutely understand the concerns that are being raised. The reassurance I can seek to provide is that there has been a significant amount of highway modelling undertaken to underpin this plan over a large number of years. I won't attempt to talk you through it. I'm not the best person to do that anyway, but through that there is a very comprehensive highways assessment report which has been produced. There are essentially 3 different models that cover the district. There's the Harlow strategic model, there's a spreadsheet model that covers Epping Forest district, and then there is I think it's a VISM model which covers Epping Forest itself. So when taken together, those 3 models provide a very comprehensive indication of the traffic impacts arising from planned growth. And obviously, as an output of that work, the County Council, together with the District Council and the Jacobs, who are the modellers, have identified the mitigation measures that are required to mitigate the impacts of planned growth. Now, clearly there are impacts on roads, clearly there are existing problems on roads, we wouldn't pretend there are not. But there is a limit to what we can do with this plan. We have to make sure we meet the test of the SIL regulations in terms of what we do, and clearly we need to make sure that development will be viable. So we work very closely with the County Council and others, including the Conservatives of Epping Forest, in order to develop a robust package of modelling and a report which substantiates what we've done. And obviously the outputs of that are set out in the plan, but also in the infrastructure delivery plan, which set out the mitigation measures that are actually required and will be funded and delivered across the district. Appreciating they might not go as far as everyone would like, but clearly we have a limitation in terms of how much can be funded and what can be funded through the development that comes forward.
Thank you. I'm keen to move on now to east of Harlow. We just to make sure that we've raised all the potential modifications to the plan. There is a modification proposed to Part G concerning heritage assets, which is along the same lines as we discussed in relation to Latin Priory. So don't intend to discuss that again unless anybody particularly wants to. Thank you. Okay, so moving on now to SP3 east of Harlow. Okay, again, if we can hear from the council first, and then from Mr. Spencer, perhaps, and also from Harlow and from Essex County Council, will be useful here to hear about the nature of the cross-boundary working, whether there are any significant outstanding issues there. It's been raised in relation to the housing trajectory as to whether which parcel is likely to come forward first, the part in Harlow or the part in Epping. And I think we heard yesterday that it's more likely actually that the parcel in Epping might come forward first. So if there's any indication of that, then that would be helpful.
Thank you, Madam. In relation to the east of Harlow, we have held high-level meetings between the key stakeholders, including this council, the main site promoters, Essex County Council, Harlow District Council and the Princess Alexandra Hospital NHS Trust. And those discussions have included the potential relocation of the hospital. Communication is ongoing with 3 smaller land promoters within the master plan area. If I cover off the cross-boundary working issue from our perspective now, is that sensible? We have worked together with Harlow District Council to ensure complementary proposals for the east of Harlow area. I refer you back to the memorandum of understanding that was signed by the 4 housing market authorities, which is EB 1202. In addition, we have established a Garden Town Developer Forum that meets regularly with the promoters and developers of all the Garden Town strategic sites. There's been ongoing duty to cooperate discussions at officer and member level, including through the Cooperation for Sustainable Development Officer Group and Member Board, and subsequently after the designation of the Garden Town Officer Group and Member Board to consider cross-boundary issues. The minutes of those member meetings are available on the Council's website under our evidence base. The Princess Alexandra Hospital NHS Trust and Essex County Council have also been party to those discussions to ensure a consistent approach. The 2 authorities, Epping Forest District and Harlow District, have worked together through particularly more recently, through the Garden Town Delivery Workstream to consider and establish an appropriate approach for bringing forward plans for the East of Harlow allocation, including having one strategic master plan. You've heard already that we sought to, as far as possible, to have consistent policies in the 2 plans. We took a paper to the Garden Town Member Board in June last year, 18th of June, that's EB 1334, which sets out an agreement on the proposed arrangements for taking forward the master plan and the subsequent applications for the 2 parts of the site, if I can put it that way. And then, as Mr. Coleman's already explained, we took that report through the Epping Forest District Council Cabinet on the 18th of October 2018 last year, and that's EB 133. And as Mr. Coleman's already explained, the Appendix 4 of that sets out the master planning process. The Cabinet here agreed that in line with the Garden Town Member Board decision, that there would be a single master plan area to straddle both the administrative boundaries, and that it would be preferable for 2 separate but otherwise identical planning applications to be submitted to each respective local authority. And it was therefore considered important that the master plan was given equal status and weight in each authority area to enable planning decisions to be made that are consistent. The Council does seek to make a number of relatively minor amendments to the boundary for the site allocation for the east of Harlow. Those boundaries will reflect the inclusion of a small number of additional sites adjacent to Moorhall Road, which is at the southern extent of the District Council allocation. You'll see if you're looking at the diagram that the allocation is actually slightly smaller than the master plan area. What we're seeking now to do is to bring within that allocation some of the sites that previously we hadn't known were available. We now do know that, so we're intending to make an amendment to bring those sites within the allocation. We have notified the relevant stakeholders of that, including the site promoter, the Princess Alexandra Hospital NHS Trust and Harlow District Council in relation to the minor amendments that we're proposing. And if it would be helpful, we're happy to provide you with a note as an examination document to set out the necessary details of those amendments.
Is that essentially the bit here?
Yes. I mean, it makes sense to us to bring it within.
I think a note as an examination document would be needed, yep.
Okay, we'll make a note of that.
Okay, and we've heard perhaps from the others about the master planning process, the stage that that's at. Are you able to say the same sorts of things about this?
I think, as you will have seen, that the recent letter that's been submitted, decision's only just been taken confirming the proposed relocation of the hospital to that site, and that is the preferred location on the Epping Forest District administrative part of the site. And I think that we've been waiting for that to progress the master planning process, so it's fair to say that that site is behind the other two.
And perhaps preempting Mr. Belton's comment then, when, if you just remind us when that was shown to commence delivery and the trajectory, and comment on what we know Mr. Belton's comment will be.
I think we'll have to come back to you on that because I haven't actually got a copy of the trajectory here with me, I'm afraid.
Mr. Belton presumably knows.
Yeah, I can probably tell. It's the year later, actually, so there is an extra 12 months in this case. So I think East of Harlow is predicted to deliver 50 units in 2023-24, rather than 22-23, which is when the other garden community sites are intended to come forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Spencer, did you want to comment first? And we perhaps hear from the hospital as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think firstly, I should say that Miller Homes has got a promotional agreement in place with all of the major landowners and controls the land allocated at East Harlow, both in Epping Forest and Harlow districts. They've been working with both local authorities on the preparation of a draft planning performance agreement, and the intention is to finalise that and press on with a strategic master plan document once the two local plan examinations have concluded. Technical work has been carried out by RPS on behalf of Miller Homes and identifies that although there are some modest landscape, heritage, flood risk and noise sensitivities on limited parts of the site, there is sufficient flexibility overall to accommodate the mix and quantum of development envisaged in both local plans. And we believe that's been demonstrated on the indicative master plan, which we've appended to our hearing statement. And that master plan is complementary with the hospital's emerging master plan as well. And in terms of delivery rates, the latest start dates and annual delivery rates are set out on page 8 of the Statement of Common Ground between Miller Homes and the two authorities. That's a signed Statement of Common Ground. I wasn't there yesterday, but I gather there was a comment about whether the Epping Forest part of the site would be delivered last. I think that's highly unlikely because for technical reasons, my client believes that the first access into the site is likely to be the centremost of the three accesses, which is near Mayfield's farm, and that would enable early housing delivery either side of the district boundary. So delivering homes to contribute to both local authorities' housing supply in the early years of the plan period. Thanks.
Mr. Lawson.
Thank you, Ma'am. Yes, just to reiterate, you'll have had the letter dated the 14th of March, which gave an update on the Trust Board's position, which was a unanimous decision to take a preferred way forward for the provision of a new hospital at Harlow, which the option is to comprise development of a new local acute hospital with ancillary facilities on approximately 12 hectares of greenfield land east of Harlow within the 5.3 strategic allocation.
So just to confirm, within the Epping allocation?
That's correct, Ma'am. And I'll draw your attention to the appendices at the back of our statement on matter 8, which shows a very broad brush test to fit master plan layout plan showing how the amount of accommodation could be fitted onto an area of approximately 12 hectares just to the north of the new Junction 7A. And we've also included a parameters plan as part of that, because although it's a greenfield site, there are a number of constraints that had to be overcome, including flood zones and a gas main that needs to be rerouted, and a health and safety executive consultation zone that needs to be observed as well. And I'm pleased to say that we've managed to accommodate all those issues and work around them. We've also, through the County Council, we commissioned Jacobs to undertake a high-level traffic modelling exercise with the objective being to identify a transport strategy with any required high-level mitigation measures to ensure that it works from a transportation point of view. And that stage of work has been completed now, and a solution has been identified with the caveat that it's acknowledged that further sensitivity testing and additional modelling needs to be progressed to give further clarity over the solution and the range of mitigation measures that will be needed. But that's an important piece of work that has been ongoing. In addition to that, we've been having discussions with the landowner's agent. There's a single landowner involved in this particular area that we're looking at, and they've been very productive discussions, and the next stage is to work towards a situation where we have some drafts, heads of agreement for a potential acquisition. although the Trust has made its decision on the 7th of March, there's still quite a few processes to go through, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, in terms of NHS improvement funding and so on. And we're at the strategic outline business case stage at the moment, and subject to confirmation of Treasury funding, likely to be in the autumn statement of this year. I should just point out that this trust and the situation that they've got to deal with has made it one of the top 2 national priorities for funding. So the trust has got sufficient confidence and certainty to progress its business case and further planning work that we're obviously involved with. And the next stage will obviously be to continue to work collaboratively with the local authority and Transport Authority too, along with Miller Homes as part of the strategic master plan process, and to work in unison to take that forward. And in terms of timing and programming, it's intended that we'll have the strategic outline case and outline business case for this investment, and it's quite a big investment as well, actually. It's for everyone's benefit, it's the build cost for the relocation is approximately £570 million, and it's a major piece of community infrastructure that will help underpin the Garden Town and key into its regeneration and place shaping strategies, and it'll also free up significant land, brownfield land within the Harlow urban area that can deliver significant numbers of houses that we're promoting through the Harlow District Plan as well. So the programme is for the business cases, strategic and outline, to be approved by NHSI next year, and moved then to full business case. But prior to full business case, it's likely that we'll be preparing a planning application with a view to rolling forward and commencing construction possibly in 2021-22, with the hospital potentially being ready to open in 24/25, which seems to fit quite well with the Junction 7A infrastructure provision. That's the background from our point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Just whilst you're speaking, if turning to the policy in this plan, are you satisfied that the policy in this plan will enable the delivery of the hospital? Do you have any concerns about the plan itself?
I think, Ma'am, since the clarification over the provision of road infrastructure no longer being pre-commencement, I think it gives us sufficient certainty to move forward, and it has a twofold purpose from the Trust point of view. One, obviously, it gives certainty from a planning perspective, and it's clear that we've got up to 14 hectares, and we have a broad location for that identified, which, as you has heard from Mr. Spencer and the council's planners, that it's fairly complementary to the other overall housing developments, but it also gives certainty and credence to the business case as well, because its outline business case, we're unlikely to be going for planning permission, but we'll need an allocation with letters of support from the authorities to ensure it's robust.
Thank you. Before we turn to the school, and I'll ask Harlow if they'd like to comment in any way on any of these points. But one of the comments that's been raised in relation to policy SP5 H is whether or not it's necessary at point 8 to, not point 8, point 6, to refer to 14 hectares of land. Now, I've seen 10 and 12. Obviously, you've now mentioned 12 and 14. Would it be appropriate to update that part to refer to 12, or is there some flexibility required?
If I can come back on that, Ma'am, I think we do need the flexibility in short. Approximately 14 hectares suits our situation. I think the reality is we'll certainly get the built footprint on a much smaller area than that, but we want to have flexibility for future growth, and also we want to make it an attractive green campus that has supporting green landscaped areas and so on to make it an appropriate health and wellbeing campus.
Mr. Spencer, did you want to comment on that point?
Yeah, just very briefly, it's not a major point for us, but from my client's point of view, I think they would appreciate greater flexibility in the policy wording. So perhaps if it was set out as a range of 10 to 14 hectares or 12 to 14, if that's necessary from the hospital's point of view, but it's not a major point.
Thank you. Thank you. Harlow.
Thank you, ma'am. Just reiterating the point that I think you started this discussion, and following on from Ms. Blom-Cooper's comments, in addition to our representations, I think what's been summarised in terms of the current position we are comfortable with, because we have been working with our partners in Epping and with Essex County Council in order to ensure that this site can be brought forward in a sustainable manner and in accordance with the overarching policy approach. And following on from the comments from Mr. Lawson, I mean, obviously that's positive news for the wider Harlow area and the Garden Town in terms of hopefully commitment to a revitalised hospital, and obviously the associated employment opportunities, additional employment opportunities that could bring. I think the only obviously point we would make is obviously to ensure that properly accords with the development of the sustainable transport corridors, so both the public and staff can get to the site in a sustainable manner rather than having to rely on the car, and that applies both, as I say, to visitors as well as staff. And I think that's work which I think Mr. Sprunt is aware of, and will probably make a separate comment in that respect.
Mr. Belton.
Thank you, Ma'am. I didn't want to disappoint you so late in the day, so I will very quickly talk about lead-in times. As we know, this site is quite a way behind the others, and just a very brief point. The sequence of trajectory events that are set out in Mr. Newton's statement are, as I've said, quite optimistic, and I think in light of the discussion we had yesterday about justification for the step trajectory, I would invite you to sort of think carefully about whether there is sufficient flexibility here. But the main point I wanted to make in relation to East Harlow is in response to the confirmation that both parts of the site are likely to come forward at the same time. And that is indeed set out on page 8 of the statement that was referred to by Mr. Spencer. Again, I would encourage you to look at those tables, because if you do, you'll see that if you treat this as a single site, as obviously now that we must, given what we've just heard, we're assuming that this site is going to start off in year 1 by delivering 150 units, and will very rapidly build up to delivering 400 units per year. And taken in isolation, I find it very difficult to accept that a site will deliver 400 units per annum for a sustained period of time, looking at all the evidence that we spoke about yesterday. But if you throw into the mix here that this site will be allegedly delivering 400 units per annum at the same time that 3 other large strategic extensions to Harlow are also going to be churning out hundreds of homes, it's just not credible in my view to suggest that this level of growth is going to come forward. There will be a reaction, there will be a correction, and that correction will be that fewer houses are ultimately delivered. Now, in this case, obviously only 750 of the units are in Epping, but what we don't know sitting here today is where that correction will be. Will the correction be in Harlow, will the correction be in Epping, or will it be a little bit of both? But what I would put to you is, again, in light of what we spoke about yesterday and the stepped approach and the need for you really to be satisfied that all has been done to positively prepare this plan and maximise the delivery of housing, particularly in the early parts of the plan period, you need to be satisfied that these numbers are deliverable, and I would put to you that they're simply not, and there has to be a revision made to the trajectory. I would suggest that much less emphasis is placed on East Harlow in the trajectory, and that can free up some numbers for you to go and suggest that other sites that can deliver in the early part of the plan period in advance of this site can come forward. And as you've heard, there are many people in the wings with such sites, my clients included.
Mr. Sprunt.
It's just a clarification with regards to some of the start dates that have been mentioned. Certainly from Mr. Spencer's comments about using the central access to be the first part into the east site is welcome, because obviously, as we mentioned earlier, Junction 7A and the associated works with that will be ongoing until the end of 2022. I note in the request from, or the representation from the hospital, that they wish SP 5.312 to the condition there to be removed. From our perspective, that isn't practicable. There will be works on site till the end of 2022, and therefore access to the junction, which would be required to get into the hospital site, wouldn't be possible until after that time. So I wouldn't want to see that condition removed at this stage. We obviously want to work with them as to see how maybe access to that site could be achieved, but it doesn't look practicable at the moment from all the discussions I've had with the delivery team for 7A.
Mr. Bolton.
Thank you. While I don't disagree with what Mr. Bolton has just told you in terms of delivery rates, I'll just remind you of the market absorption figures I gave you yesterday with regard to sales, overall residential sales in Harlow, and the fact that you would be you're looking at a 60% increase in that in terms of new house sales, which is challenging, I think, to say the least. But I'll go back to the point I made earlier when we were talking about the Greenbelt. I don't think we're in a situation where it's, you know, you're pitching one site against another here. I think you have a requirement which is much higher than is being planned for, especially in the early years of the plan. And I think that a properly constructed plan would have a range of both strategic sites in, such as these, but also have a number of smaller sites which are able to deliver earlier, simply because they are less complicated and have less infrastructure requirements. That, to me, would be a sound plan. So I don't think we need to get into a bun fight over particular numbers. I think both are needed in terms of where the OAN is. And the plan just needs to be modified accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. If we just hear from Mr. Spencer, and then I want to hear about the school.
Thank you, Ma'am. With regard to delivery rates, my client's position is that a delivery rate of up to 400 dwellings per annum is entirely achievable at Easter Harlow, and that would be achievable with several developers operating from multiple outlets on the site. And I've got an example for you, Ma'am. Elsewhere in Essex, a site that we acted as planning consultants on, there's a strategic approved development of 4,300 homes at Bewley and Channels in North East Chelmsford. Well, that began delivering new homes in 2015-16, and in year one it produced 71 completions from 2 outlets. Year 2, it produced 282 completions from 4 outlets. And Year 3, it produced 372 completions from 6 outlets. And deliveries forecasted to continue increasing up to Year 6, which will be 2020-2021, when 446 completions are expected from 7 outlets. And they're all verified figures, ma'am, that were presented to the Chelmsford Local Plan examination in December as part of document EB 063C. And I think they demonstrate that the annual completion rates we've used in the Statement of Common Ground are realistic. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we hear about the secondary school as referred to in Part 8 of the policy?
Yes, indeed. In terms of the location of the secondary school on the east of Harlow allocation, no definitive decision has been made as to the precise location. So it is considered that we should have a policy requirement to enable flexibility in terms of location, although it's currently proposed within the Epping Forest District administrative boundary. Equally, it may well need to be located within the Harlow District side of the allocation. I think what is clear is that we need a secondary school to meet the needs of that planned growth. So we are proposing a modification to enable alternative uses if the secondary school is not provided within the FDC portion of the allocation site. I'll come back to that later unless you want me to deal with that modification now about alternative
If you deal with it
uses.
now, and then we'll hear from the County Council.
So recognising that the provision of the secondary school could be located elsewhere within the master plan area, we are recognising the requirements set out in the policy are necessary to ensure the site is developed in a way as to enable it to be sustainable, self-sufficient. We are suggesting that the policy is amended having regard to the views with our partner authorities in the Garden Town to maximise delivery of development to meet identified needs, subject to the important environmental and other constraints that have been discussed at this examination. So what we're essentially intending is that we will consider proposing a modification should the secondary school not come forward within the FDC part of the site.
Did you want to comment on that, Mr. Cook?
Yeah, essentially, I find myself needing to concur with everything that's just been said around the secondary school position. The County Council is clear that a secondary school will be needed for this location and to serve the growth requirements arising from both the planned growth in Harlow and Epping Forest. Whether that secondary school goes into the Epping Forest portion or the Harlow portion, the County Council would not want to be prescriptive about. What we would actually require is a position to be as central as possible in order that the school is as accessible as possible within the overall development by sustainable modes and particularly by walking. In terms of actual detailed site requirements, the County Council has detailed requirements which are set out in the Essex County Council Developers Guide to Infrastructure Contributions. I'm afraid I can't quote you the reference to that. It's in the documents list, but I wouldn't suggest pouring through all those detailed requirements anyway. But the point is that there's a detailed list of site land compliance checks exercise that needs to be done, such as the topography of the site, the location in relation to access, its security, making sure that the has land for playing pitches, no flood risk and things like that, fairly common sense type considerations, but quite detailed considerations. So the County Council could not be prescriptive at this point in time as to where that site should be. But once that land compliance check exercise has been done, then no doubt a site would wash out in terms of either one of those two locations in either district. So I think in terms of the flexibility as to which of the two districts the site is actually going to end up being in, I think it would be extremely helpful from the County Council's point of view to have that flexibility that's just been mentioned by Ms Blom-Cooper, so that if it's not achievable to have the secondary school within the Epping Forest part, then there should be flexibility for it to be in the Harlow part and vice versa. So the County Council would be strongly supportive of that kind of flexibility.
Thank Could I just ask Mr. Spencer perhaps to comment first as to how that fits with the master planning work that you're doing, and then ask Harlow about the flexibility available within their policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to say the master plan we've appended to our hearing statement is very much a proving layout to demonstrate that the mix and quantum of development in both plans can be accommodated on site. It doesn't seek to define or prescribe a particular piece of land for the secondary school, but we would certainly welcome the flexibility that, that the secondary school could be located in either district, and we imagine that that will come out through the further strategic master planning work.
Ms. Forgioni?
Thank you. Yes, we support everything that's just been said. We have a policy HS3 for the strategic housing site east of Harlow, which refers to the need for education facilities. It's not overly prescriptive of whether that's a secondary school or not, so there is flexibility in our policy to provide the necessary education facilities in the Harlow part of the site if required. There will be some modifications proposed within the text of the plan in agreement with Essex County Council to refer to the need that there will be a secondary school and primary school facilities as well. So we agree that there's enough flexibility in our plan to enable that to happen if necessary.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I just want to cover the other relatively minor points on my agenda, and then I'll ask if everyone's said all that they want to. So, again, I think we've discussed the heritage modification. Note that. There was also a question raised as to whether it was necessary to remove the Biodiversity Action Plan habitat designation from MAP 2.4 and to clarify the location of an area tree preservation order. Was that something you raised, Mr. Spencer? If you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely, ma'am. According to our evidence, there's no need for the BAP habitat designation, although I do understand that the council are now proposing to remove that, so we'd obviously withdraw our objection if that was the case. And I think it would be helpful to have to add to the legend on the plan, just to confirm that the green continuous green hatching refers to the area TPO, I believe.
Thank you. Is that the area to the south-east?
I gather it's to the north of the BAP area, just where the label SP 5.3 is, just underneath that.
Oh, I see.
I think.
Okay. Ms. Baum-Cooper?
Yes, sorry, ma'am. We are, as Mr. Spencer has confirmed, proposing minor amendments to remove the BAP habitat designation from the site. We have notified the relevant stakeholders of this, including the site promoters and Harlow District Council, and as has also been raised, and I think we discussed previously, we will be seeking to put a full legend to the map in order to provide clarity, and that will include the area tree preservation order designation as shown on map 2.4.
And just so I'm aware of it, for reporting in due course, what's the reason for removing the BAP designation?
It was wrongly...
It was wrong. Okay, fine. Thank you. And then something that the County Council had raised, part 16, concerning the volume of water discharging into Pinsey Brook.
Yes, in accordance with the hearing statement, paragraph 90 of that, we are proposing to amend the wording to address the representations made by Essex County Council, and that has been agreed in the draft statement to common ground with Essex County Council, and that's document ED10. So we are intending to put an additional bit of wording onto policy SP5 part H, little 16. Would you like me to read?
No, that's
that
okay.
policy?
But I would just perhaps ask the County Council if that would satisfy your objection. Yeah.
Yeah, I can confirm we've agreed to that, and that is in the statement of common ground as been spelled out. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. That concludes everything that I want to ask. Does anyone have any outstanding points they want to make in relation to East of Harlow in particular, or anything else? No. Thank you. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you. Close at 5 o'clock.